How far would you go for the truth? When love turns to betrayal and secrets come to light, one man takes matters into his own hands in a way no one saw coming. Stay till the end, because this story isn't just shocking, it's unforgettable. My wife, Susan, was always a punctual woman. We had routines, not strict ones, but unchanging ones. We always had dinner together at exactly 7, and that was our time to talk about the day. But a few weeks ago, something changed. She started coming home later, and instead of apologies, I heard vague explanations about extra work or traffic. I tried to ignore it, but an uneasy feeling crept inside me, like a predator stalking its prey. One evening, I was sitting at the table, twirling my fork as the clock ticked past 8:15. She still wasn't home. I picked up my phone and called her. She answered after the third ring, her voice distant, as if she was talking to a colleague reminding her of a meeting, not her husband. "Sorry, Jake, I'm still at work. Just finishing a report," she said. I froze, feeling something break inside me. Her workday always ended at 6. Over the next few days, I started noticing oddities. Susan's phone, which used to always sit on the kitchen counter, was now out of sight. She kept it in her pocket or placed it face down. Her smile became rare, and the nervous laugh she gave in response to my questions only deepened my suspicions. "You're hiding something, aren't you, Susan?" I asked one evening. She looked at me across the table, her eyes tense like a cornered animal. "What are you getting at, Jake?" she snapped, then walked to the bedroom without waiting for an answer. That night, I couldn't sleep. My head was spinning with thoughts I couldn't shut off. It wasn't just paranoia. It was a whisper in my mind, warning me that something was happening. Something destructive. A week later, I had to admit it, my life was no longer the same. We had become strangers living under one roof. Her phone calls became frequent, but she always left the room to answer them. The conversations were brief, but her face changed afterward. Sometimes it was embarrassment, sometimes a fleeting smile, one I hadn't seen directed at me in years. One evening, I saw her lock herself in the bathroom with her phone. I approached the door and listened. Susan whispered to someone, "No, it's too risky. He might suspect something." I felt the blood freeze in my veins. Those were the first words that turned my doubts into a chilling certainty. She was hiding something, or someone. The anxiety was pulling me under like quicksand. I felt like I was slowly drowning in my own suspicions. One night, when Susan was fast asleep, I got out of bed and quietly left the bedroom. Her handbag was on the kitchen table. Her phone was always with her, but I knew she never locked her bag. My hands trembled as I unzipped it. Inside was the usual assortment: cosmetics, her wallet, keys. And then I found something unexpected, a small slip of paper with an address I didn't recognize and a time, Tuesday, 7 p.m. I took out my phone and snapped a picture of the note. The next morning, as she stepped out of the shower, I stood in the kitchen brewing coffee like always. For a moment, I thought she noticed something, maybe the faint change in my gaze, but she said nothing. She just put on her blazer, kissed me on the cheek, and left. On Tuesday, I knew I had to act. I left work a few hours early and parked my car 2 blocks from her house. The address on the note turned out to be a cozy cafe with large windows. I parked nearby, reclined my seat, and waited. Susan arrived right at 7, just as the note indicated. I watched as she got out of her car, glancing around nervously. She looked different, more polished than usual. Her hair was neatly styled, and she carried a box of chocolates, holding it as if it was a key to something significant. And then I saw him. A man in his mid-40s, tall, wearing a sharp business suit, exuding confidence. They hugged, not just a casual embrace, but one that spoke volumes. My heart felt like it stopped. They went into the cafe and sat at a window table. Their conversation appeared effortless, but I could see the smile on her face, the kind she no longer showed me. I tried to make out his features, short-cropped hair and sharp, angular lines that suggested a man accustomed to getting his way. They stayed there for about an hour. I couldn't move, even when my legs went numb, and my fingers ached from gripping the steering wheel too tightly. When they left the cafe, she took his hand. In the parking lot, he leaned toward her ear, whispered something, and she nodded. I didn't know what he said, but the smile she gave him shattered something deep inside me. I watched as he helped her into her car, watched her drive off, and watched him walk away in the opposite direction. I wanted to leap out of the car, confront him, demand answers. But instead, I sat frozen, feeling my hands drop limply onto the wheel. Driving home, one question repeated in my mind. What was that? I still couldn't tell if it was betrayal or if I had latched onto a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew I was closer to the truth than I wanted to admit. When Susan returned home, I was already in bed, pretending to sleep. She carefully lay down next to me, but I caught her scent. When I woke up the next morning, I knew I couldn't live in the dark anymore. My instinct screamed that Susan was hiding more than just a casual friendship with a stranger. I had to find undeniable proof. My friend Joe, a tech-savvy guy, always said everything you need to know about someone is in their phone, more than they know themselves. Joe was going to help me, but first I had to get her phone. That evening, when Susan was taking a shower, I seized my chance. Her phone was on the nightstand next to the bed. A part of me hesitated. I knew I was crossing a line, but at that moment I didn't care. I knew her password. It was our wedding anniversary. How ironic that felt now. Quickly, I plugged in the device Joe had given me and started downloading her data. My hands grew sweatier with every passing second as her messages, emails, and photos transferred to my computer. When I was done, I put the phone back exactly as I found it, then sat on the couch and turned on the TV, pretending everything was normal. She walked out of the bathroom, a towel wrapped around her head, and thankfully didn't notice a thing. Later that night, after Susan had fallen asleep, I opened my laptop. Her messages popped up on the screen. There were conversations with friends, co-workers, and family, nothing out of the ordinary. But one contact stood out. Mark. They texted each other every day. I read how she shared her thoughts with him, things she hadn't said to me in years. The messages were warm, vibrant, full of sincerity, but none of that compared to what I saw next. I never thought I'd meet someone like you, she wrote. You make me happy, Sue, he replied. Sometimes I feel like I'm ready to leave everything for you, but it's so complicated. I couldn't breathe. I read those words over and over, hoping I'd misunderstood. But the text was painfully clear. She wasn't just talking to him, she was in love with him. In one of her latest messages, she wrote, I need time. I know I have to tell him, but I don't want to hurt him. Him. That was me. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold wave crash over me. My chest ached. We'd been together for 10 years, and now it was all gone. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to meet her eyes. She acted like everything was normal, smiling, making breakfast, asking about my day. How could she? How could she look me in the face, knowing she was hiding this? I went to work, but my thoughts kept spiraling. With each hour, the tension inside me grew until I knew I couldn't wait. I needed more information. That evening, I installed a tracking app on her phone. It made me feel like a terrible person, but I knew it was the only way to uncover the whole truth. Over the next week, I monitored her movements and read her messages. She started meeting Mark more frequently. Time that she was supposed to spend at work was instead spent with him. But one detail kept gnawing at me. In one of his texts, Mark wrote, "We need to do this as soon as possible. You know, it's not just your future at stake. It's mine too." What did that mean? The next day, I felt something inside me snap. It wasn't just anger, it was a blend of pain, humiliation, and despair. I was betrayed. Betrayed by the woman I loved, the woman I gave up everything else for. I tried to work, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. The memories of our happiest moments now felt like cruel mockery. I remembered her laughter, her smile, her touch. And now, all of it felt like a lie. That evening, I locked myself in my basement workshop. Among the tools and old boxes, I tried to find some solace for my thoughts. But they wouldn't leave me alone. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and played an old recording of our wedding video. We were so happy. She looked at me with such love that it was hard to believe she was the same woman now writing to another man. "You are my everything." The pain was overwhelming. I wanted to scream. I threw the glass against the wall, watching it shatter into pieces, just like my life had. But then something else emerged from the pain: anger. I was no longer a victim. Now, I wanted to act. I wanted her to understand that her betrayal wouldn't go unanswered. I started thinking about Mark. Who was he? What made him better than me? And most importantly, what had he done to deserve her? I didn't have answers, but I knew one thing. This man had destroyed my family, and I couldn't let him walk away unscathed. I spent the night on my computer, digging into everything I could find about Mark. His social media profiles, his work profile, even old forum posts. I discovered he was a manager at a large firm. Married, with 2 kids. That fact stopped me cold. He hadn't just taken my wife, he was betraying his own family too. I started to formulate a plan. Not just a plan for revenge, but something bigger. I wanted him to feel the same pain I felt. By morning, I had my first idea. I decided to start with his wife. She deserved to know the truth. And while it might seem petty, I wanted to see his life crumble the way mine had. I printed out photos of their messages, took screenshots of her confessions of love to him, and put them all in an envelope. Then I sent it to Mark's home address with a note. "You deserve to know who your husband really is." But I didn't stop there. I knew this was only the beginning. If he was tearing apart my life, I'd do the same to his career. His job was tied to important contacts, business deals, and his reputation. If I could find a way to cast doubt on his professionalism, it would be the second blow. When I finished those steps, I felt a strange satisfaction. My anger was no longer out of control. It had become a tool. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I had control over the situation. After delivering the first blow, I realized I needed more ammunition. I couldn't act blindly if I wanted my revenge to be flawless. This time, I approached it with cold calculation. No more emotional outbursts. I spent the entire night on my computer, delving deeper into Mark's life. He had a wife named Laura, who, according to her social media, was a homemaker devoted to charity work and yoga. They had 2 children, a boy around 8 years old and a younger girl. From the outside, they looked like the perfect family. But I knew that perfect facades often hid cracks. I decided to dig further. Who did he work with? Who were his friends? How did he spend his time? I began by analyzing his online activity. I joined private groups where he interacted with colleagues, found old forums where he left comments. Soon, I had a picture of a man who was ambitious but selfish and a little vain. On one site, I found an old exchange with a coworker where he bragged about advancing his career by manipulating data. This could be useful. Next, I moved on to his daily routine. I installed a simple GPS tracker on his car. It was easy, given that I already knew where he met my wife. Now, I wanted to understand his schedule. For the first few days, the tracker didn't show anything unusual. Home, office, gym, home. Everything looked like a typical routine. But one evening he deviated. He drove to another part of town, and I followed him. He parked outside a bar. Inside, he joined a group of men, co-workers by the looks of it. But what caught my attention happened a few hours later. Mark left the bar, but not alone. A woman was with him. Not Susan. I snapped several pictures. Now, I had proof that he wasn't just destroying my family, he was living a double life. This gave me another card to play in my hand. When I returned home, I began sorting through all the information I'd gathered. Here's what I had: photos of his meetings with my wife, screenshots of their messages, evidence of his manipulations at work, pictures of him with another woman cheating on his own wife. I realized I could strike from multiple angles. First, I decided to inform his wife. She needed to know the full extent of his infidelity, not just with my wife, but with another woman as well. Next, I began compiling a dossier for his company. This required precision. If I moved too early, he might trace it back to me. I decided to wait for the perfect moment. Everything was ready. I no longer felt broken. I was no longer the victim. I was the hunter and he was my prey. I sat at my desk, staring at the dossier I had built. This was my weapon, capable of tearing apart someone's life. And the first step was Mark's wife, Laura. I drafted an anonymous message. "Hi, you don't know me, but I think you deserve to know the truth. Your husband, Mark, has been seeing my wife for months. I have evidence. If you want it, I can send it to you." I attached a few photos to the message, created an anonymous account, and sent it to Laura. She responded a few hours later. She was in shock. At first, she didn't believe me. I sent her more photos, screenshots of messages, and even the pictures of him with another woman. Laura was devastated. She asked to meet in person, but I refused. I couldn't risk exposing myself. This was her fight now. 2 days later, chaos erupted. The day after my message, Laura confronted Mark at home, screaming at him. She called his office, berating him for destroying their family. That evening, Mark tried to calm things down, but his attempts at damage control failed miserably. The neighbors began whispering. I watched it all through the cameras I had set up near their house. Seeing the cracks form in his perfect life gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. Laura posted a passive-aggressive status on social media. It's hard to understand how someone you trust can be so deceitful, but the truth always comes out. I waited to see what would happen next. Mark began avoiding public interactions. His colleagues noticed that he no longer joined them in the cafeteria and spent all his time locked in his office. This was only the first crack. Soon, I sent another anonymous message, this time to the other woman he was seeing. I found her through their mutual posts on Instagram. I attached the same evidence, photos of him with Susan and information about his personal life. She replied within hours. Turns out, she didn't know he was married either. I watched as her comments on his posts disappeared one by one. A few days later, she posted a heartbreaking update about being lied to and betrayed. Now, Mark was at the center of a storm. His wife threatened divorce, and his mistress had cut ties with him. He looked like a man on the verge of collapse. For the first time, I felt like I had full control. This was only the beginning. The real blow was yet to come. Mark had built his life on a successful career at a prominent corporation. His social status and professional reputation were the foundations of his perfect life. But I knew those foundations were fragile, and I intended to tear them down. Using the evidence I'd gathered, I compiled a detailed dossier. It included screenshots of his messages with my wife and his mistress, photos of their meetings, and the data manipulation he had bragged about. I sent the dossier anonymously to his company's HR department, attaching a formal letter explaining how his actions were damaging the company's reputation. I cited their corporate policies to make the complaint look professional and credible. The response was swift. Within a week, rumors began circulating in his workplace. Mark was summoned to a meeting with upper management. He looked tense when he arrived at the office and left hours earlier than usual. Days later, the rumors were confirmed. Mark was temporarily suspended while an internal investigation was conducted. His colleagues began avoiding him, and his name became the subject of hushed office gossip. Joe, my tech-savvy friend, kept me updated. He told me that after reviewing the financial reports and complaints about his behavior, Mark was at risk of not only losing his position, but also being blacklisted from the industry. Mark's life was unraveling, not just at home, but at work too. I was getting closer to my goal. Mark tried to salvage the situation. He begged his wife to stay, insisting that he'd been framed. But Laura was resolute. She filed for divorce, took their children, and moved in with her parents. His house now looked dark and empty. One evening, I watched him sitting in his car outside his home, gripping the steering wheel and staring straight ahead. He looked utterly broken. Meanwhile, his former mistress posted a scathing exposé about how he'd lied to her. The post went viral, drawing even more attention to his downfall. Mark was now left with nothing. No family, no career, no future. Susan knew something was different about me. She couldn't pinpoint it, but she sensed it. Our conversations had become surface level, short, almost transactional. I avoided her gaze, and when she tried to start a meaningful conversation, I either gave her one-word answers or found a reason to leave the room. One evening, as I walked through the front door, Susan was waiting in the kitchen. She had set the table and cooked my favorite meal, rosemary chicken. I barely glanced at the plate. "Jake," she began, her voice trembling. "We need to talk." I said nothing. She sat down across from me, her hands visibly shaking. "I know you know something," she said quietly. I stared at her, my anger barely contained. Inside, I felt like a volcano ready to erupt. I wanted to scream, accuse her, demand answers. Instead, I stood up, walked to the living room, and grabbed the folder I'd prepared, evidence of her betrayal. I placed it on the table in front of her. "This is what I know, Susan," I said. She hesitated, then opened the folder. Her face went pale as she sifted through the photos, screenshots, and notes. Tears welled up in her eyes as she covered her face with her hands and began sobbing. "It's not true. This isn't me," she whispered, but then her voice trailed off. She realized there was no point in lying anymore. I didn't give her a chance to explain. I spoke, my words sharp and cutting. "I saw you with him, Susan. I read the texts. I know everything. How you told him you were ready to leave me. How you told him he made you happy. Do you even realize what you've done? You destroyed everything we built. You threw us away for what? For some guy who already ruined his own family." Susan tried to interrupt, but I didn't let her. "And you know what's worse?" I continued. "You didn't think about the consequences. You didn't care about the fallout. You just did it, assuming I'd never find out." Tears streamed down her face. "Jake, I made a mistake. It was madness. I don't know why I did it," she stammered. "It doesn't matter why, Susan," I said. "It's done. You destroyed us. There's no going back." She dropped to her knees in front of me, clutching my hands, begging for another chance. "Please, Jake. I'll do anything to fix this. I'll start over. We can start over. I love you. I've always loved you. This was just a mistake." "I was confused," she pleaded. I felt tears running down my own face, not from sadness, not from anger, but from the realization that whatever love I once had for her was gone. "Susan," I said softly, Love isn't something you can break and expect to piece back together. You killed us, and now I have to leave. I turned and walked out of house. The cold night air hit me like a wave, but for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. I felt lighter, freer, as though a massive weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I left the house Susan and I had shared for so many years and moved into a modest apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a small space with bare walls and a view of a quiet park, but it was mine. It was far from the memories of what we had built and what had been destroyed. The first few nights were the hardest. The apartment felt too quiet, the air too still. The silence forced me to confront my emotions, the loss, the anger, the sadness. But I knew I needed this time. I needed to rebuild myself from the ground up. Every morning, I started going for runs in the park across the street. At first, it was just a way to clear my mind, to burn off the restless energy that had consumed me since everything fell apart. But over time, those runs became something more. The crisp air, the sound of my feet on the trail, it all felt like small steps toward a new beginning. At work, I threw myself into projects I'd neglected for years. I started saying yes to opportunities one would have once avoided. Slowly, I noticed a change. My colleagues began treating me with more respect, appreciating the ideas and leadership I was finally showing. It was like I was waking up after years of being on autopilot. One morning, during one of my usual runs, I was stopped by a woman walking a golden retriever. The dog bounded over to me, tail wagging, and nearly knocked me off balance. "I'm so sorry," the woman called out, hurrying over with an apologetic smile. "He thinks everyone is his best friend." Her voice was warm, her laughter soft and genuine. We started talking, just casual conversation at first. Her name was Emily, and she had recently moved to the neighborhood. She was kind in a way that felt unassuming, and there was a sincerity in her that I hadn't realized I missed. What started as short exchanges during my morning runs grew into something more. One day, she invited me for coffee. We sat on a bench by the park, talking about everything and nothing. Emily had a simplicity about her that was refreshing. She wasn't trying to impress me or hide behind any facade. She was just real. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of something I thought I'd lost, hope. A few months later, I stood on the porch of a new house I had purchased just outside the city. It wasn't grand or flashy, but it felt like a home. The large windows let in sunlight, and the backyard had just enough space for the garden I'd always wanted. While unpacking, I came across an old box of photographs. Inside was a picture of Susan and me on our wedding day. For a long time, I stared at the image. Her smile had once been my whole world, and now it felt like a distant memory. But instead of anger or pain, I felt something unexpected: peace. I realized I no longer held on to the bitterness or resentment. The love I once felt for her had died, but I wasn't angry anymore. I had moved on, and now it was time to forgive, not for her sake, but for mine. I placed the photo back in the box, sealing it away for good. Emily and I continued to see each other, though neither of us rushed anything. We simply enjoyed each other's company, taking things slow. She became a bright spot in my days, a reminder that not all connections were meant to hurt. One evening, as we sat together on my porch watching the sun set, Emily reached over and took my hand. "Jake," she said softly, "I don't know what your past was like, but I'm glad you're here now. With me." I turned to her and smiled, a real smile. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. After I left, Susan's life seemed to spiral out of control. She stayed in the house we once shared, but it was no longer a home. The warmth we had built together was gone. Every room must have been a haunting reminder of what she had lost: her circle of friends, The same people who had encouraged her reckless choices began to drift away. They weren't there for her when she needed support. Mark, the man she had risked everything for, turned out to be nothing but a hollow promise. After his career and marriage imploded, he disappeared without so much as a goodbye. Desperate to reclaim some semblance of stability, Susan quit her job, telling mutual acquaintances that she needed a fresh start. But every attempt to rebuild her professional life was met with whispers about her past. Her reputation had followed her, casting a long shadow over every interview and new opportunity. She wrote me several letters in the months that followed, apologizing, explaining, pleading. In her words, she admitted to sleepless nights, haunted by memories of the life we once had and the sound of the door closing behind me. But I didn't reply. My silence, I realized, was the only answer I could give her. Months later, I ran into one of Susan's old friends, one of the few who still kept in touch with her. She told me Susan had started therapy. She's trying to figure herself out, the friend said. She's not the same person, Jake. She's changed. But I knew, even if she had changed, it was far too late for us. Susan tried to find a new job but struggled to gain traction. Eventually, she began volunteering at a local charity that distributed food to the homeless. Maybe it was her way of atonement, or maybe it was the only place she felt she could find purpose. Not long after she sold the house, she told people she couldn't bear to live there anymore, surrounded by memories of what she had destroyed. She moved to a small town where no one knew her, hoping for a fresh start. Her life became quieter, simpler. She lived alone in a modest apartment and worked part-time at a local library. She spent her days surrounded by books and rarely ventured beyond her routines. One day, I finally opened one of the letters she sent me. I didn't know why I chose to read that particular one, but something compelled me. Jake, she wrote, I've come to realize that love isn't about freedom to do whatever you want. It's about responsibility to yourself and to the person you choose to share your life with. I lost sight of that, and I paid the price. I'll carry that lesson with me for the rest of my life. She ended the letter with a simple wish. I hope you're happy. I hope you find peace. That's all I ask for now. I don't deserve anything else. In time, I heard bits and pieces about her life. Susan kept to herself, avoiding the few mutual friends we had left. Her days were spent at the library or walking through the quiet streets of her new town. She had withdrawn from the chaos she once embraced, retreating into a solitude that seemed both penance and protection. She learned to live with the consequences of her choices. The bright, ambitious woman I had once loved was now someone who had been profoundly humbled. She found meaning in small, quiet things, but the spark she once had never returned. Her story became her own tragedy, a cautionary tale about how fleeting moments of desire can destroy the things that truly matter. But in her quiet solitude, she found a kind of clarity. And though she would never be part of my life again, I hoped she had found the peace she sought. Every ending is just the beginning of another story waiting to be told. Don't stop now. Click to discover more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat.